Andrew Bennett, he was the MP in Stockport Northern following out Denton Reddish for 30 years, and he's got a lot of stories to tell about what happened when he got elected and the various things that have happened in Stockport over many, many years. Over to you, Andrew.
Right, well I suppose the thing to remind people of is that Stockport actually had Labour MPs in the 1912 and 1920 sort of period, but sadly in 1945 Stockport didn't go like so many other boroughs which had two members Labour. It stayed staunchly Conservative, which was, I think, pretty disappointing for the local party since they'd been quite well organised. And again in 1950 they just failed, but it was getting pretty close. By the 1951 election, of course, when it was split into North and South, the Tories and Liberals did a deal by which the Liberals wouldn't stand in the general election, the Tories wouldn't stand in various wards in the town, and again Labour just failed. And the same happened in 55, the by-election as well, and when it got to 1959, Stan Orme was the candidate in Stockport South, and there were great hopes that he would actually manage to win it, and right up to handing in nominations there was going to be a Liberal candidate, and I think if there'd been a Liberal candidate he would have won. He certainly felt he would have won, and so did Alf Lomas, who was his agent at that stage, but they didn't, and there was, I think, considerable disappointment after the 59. Right, so they'd done pretty well in the 1966 general election, and Al Gregory was a very conscientious local MP. One or two people didn't think he was quite dynamic enough. I think Jeff Spencer wasn't totally impressed with him. But he really worked very hard locally. Never voted against the government all the time he was there, and popular locally. But as far as Arnold was concerned, he did a pretty good job. Morris, although he's bought a house, hardly ever lived in it. In fact, he let Brian Slag rent it from him when Brian became the agent. There was quite a bit of friction there between the two of them. But Morris just came up once a month, did his advice bureaus, did whatever an agent found for him to do on the Friday, and then did the advice bureau Saturday morning and went. But the real key, as far as both of them were concerned, was the Roberts Arundel dispute, I think 1967 or 68. It was a very bitter dispute. An American company came in, bought up a Stockport firm, and were determined to break the AU. And of course the AU was always very strong in Stockport, and equally determined that they were not going to give way to this sort of strike breaking from the United States. And so there was this battle again between the AU and local people, and Whittam was selected. Now, by some oddity, the regional office decided that there'd been an irregularity in sending out the notices. Now, if ever there was a stitch-up, that was it, because I can't have seen anything, never heard a word about the irregularity. It was something to do with the letters went out a day too late for calling people to the selection meeting. Anyway, it was all declared null and void, and the process was to be repeated. And I got a nomination from Lancashire Hill, and also Reddish Green, and Whittam obviously got nominations, Machin got nominations, and the post office engineers nominated a woman whose name I've forgotten from Preston, and turned up on the Sunday morning, and I wasn't very hopeful about Stockport, and in fact I was a little bit more worried about the Bury seat, which I was supposed to go to a selection meeting in the afternoon. Anyway, it was held in the Nook. Now the Nook was a very fine old building in the sense that it was a prefab, I think, of some sort, but we were put in the little room, and next door, as you were there, we had the meeting itself. You could hear every word in the little room of what went on in the main room. Now, of course, you weren't supposed to, as candidates, to hear what the others said, but we listened to each other, and at the end of it, The first vote, we were told, Whittam got 21 votes, Machin I think got 15, and I got I think 13, and the woman from Preston got 4, so she dropped out and the votes were redistributed. The result was that that Whittam was still in front, but Machin and I tied on 16 votes, so there was a vote off and I beat Machin. But at this point Whittam had told us all in the little room, well, it's a waste of time, I won it, demanding that we shook hands with him. But I think it was Machin at that point had said, just hang on a minute, you'll see what happens. Anyway, of course, I went through into the final vote and I beat Whittam quite significantly. Well, Whittam was very upset, as I think he probably had some right to, demanding that there was action from Transport House as it was then. But nothing transpired and I ended up being the candidate for Stockport North. In fact, in the autumn of '73, I'd worked very hard to try and get together a good team of people. Andy Viday had been appointed as agent. I think you were on posters. There were various other jobs that were allocated, but it was agreed at the meeting in late '73 that we'd have a meeting early in January to sort of report progress on all the actions. Margaret Pollard was to do postal votes. Before we could even have that meeting, of course, the election had been held and people worked fantastically hard. Margaret Pollard got a lot of postal votes, but key in that postal vote campaign was the Dr. Metra, I think, from North Reddish. Mater, who went round, because you had to have a medical certificate on all of them, visited everybody that we needed a certificate signing for, not only got them to fill up the forms to get postal vote, but in the weekend after the postal votes went out, went round again and collected them all in. Not something that would be approved on now by the Electoral Commission, but very important. And we had a pretty good campaign, and of course we won by 203 votes.
Yes, I remember that.
It was a bit too close to call, but we won. And of course Morris held on to Stockport South without any difficulty. So I suppose while we're on elections, the next one was 1979. Now, of course, you were my agent, and again, we were on a pretty good campaign. You allowed me a fairly free hand with the literature, and I had more or less identified that if we were going to win, we had to squeeze the Liberal vote, and particularly in the sort of Heatons of the part of the constituency, we had to win people over who were neutral. So you agreed that we would have an introductory leaflet which had a poster on the front of it, and then an election address, but we would have 10 little leaflets, and they were all, in Orthodox Labour Party terms, too long. They took up things like animal rights, civil liberties, child poverty, those sort of issues. A little bit went wrong with the delivering because we had good teams of deliverers, but some of the teams couldn't cope with all of the ones, and of course quite a few of the people, you gave them on the Monday and said, please can you deliver them on the Monday and Tuesday, and they hadn't got round to delivering them till the following weekend. So on the last Sunday there were 1 or 2 roads where there were perhaps 3 people going down delivering leaflets which should have gone out earlier. But in spite of that, all the leaflets got delivered. But then you came up with a crucial blow to my morale. Don't think you realised it. On the Wednesday night, you proudly told me that we'd got 16,000 Labour promises. And you felt everybody worked very hard to get those. I knew in my heart. Are the other elections that we need to sort of mention? I think the 87 election was one of the disappointments, because I think Shirley Haynes could just about have won it in the new Stockport seat. Unfortunately, she did a Council of Churches meeting in the Heatons, and did very badly, was outshone by the Liberal and by the Tory. And I think that was the point at which her vote began to fall away. And of course we didn't actually win the Stockport seat back until Anne Coffey won it in '92. But I suspect that other people who can talk about that a little bit more. When I was selected for Stockport, I think one of the things that shocked me almost more than anything else was the state that the old housing was in Stockport. Stockport Labour Party, in control of the council between sort of in various periods from 45 up to 1974, had done pretty well with building some very good council housing. I mean, Brillington was a fantastic estate when it was first built, and there was some good housing in North Reddish that was built at the same time. But nothing had been done about the old terraces, except in a few places knock them down. And the first time I went out canvassing in Edgeley, I went out with Margaret Hayes, and we'd been working. It was a nice May evening, or I suppose it might be April evening. We'd been knocking a few doors, and then I suddenly saw these 3 or 4 rats in the streets, playing more or less about, and I was pretty shocked. And what shocked me even more was when I pointed them out to Margaret Hayes. She didn't actually express any horror. She just almost implied that that was normal for Stockport. And so I was pretty appalled by it. And there was some pretty bad housing in Reddish, and particularly in Edgeley. And one of the things that we achieved by the Labour government in the 70s was to get these urban renewal schemes going. First in Edgeley, then in Heaton Norris, and then up in North Reddish, well, in the whole of Reddish. And they really made a difference. Now, I did pretty well when I got into Parliament, making my maiden speech the first night, talking about housing, and that had 2 effects. One was that it pushed housing pretty high up my agenda, but it also was a nice rebuff to the Tories, because of course they had 2 Tory MPs in for Stockport who were notorious for saying nothing, and I managed to get in quickly, and it was, I think, one of the things that helped me. But the achievement in actually turning the housing round, I would claim some credit for it in getting Stockport allocated the resources, but it was also an illustration of where really good councillors made a difference. And as far as the Edgeley scheme was concerned, it was Vincent Holland who put in a huge amount of effort, so that not only was the scheme done and done very well, but local people were pleased with it. And I think it's a tribute to the Labour Party's efforts that there is a lot of very good old terraced housing in Edgeley. The same happened in Heaton Norris. I think it was Des Green who was the councillor putting most of the effort there. And a little bit later, Reddish, where yourself, and perhaps not to mention it, but Anne Graham, put in a lot of effort. And what's interesting is because of the effort to get them done, but the way in which local people were consulted and able to have their say, all those 3 housing renewal areas have held up remarkably well. So you can go to housing renewal in an awful lot of the areas to the north of Manchester, and you can see those areas that have slipped back and lost their attractions, whereas as far as Stockport's concerned, they actually have lasted. And I think there are an awful lot of people who are living in those now who are very proud of them as owner-occupiers. Pretty good work. Also, there was a lot of environmental work done at the same time by young unemployed people. So that was, I think, one of, I would claim, my achievements, but also very much the Labour Party in Stockport making an effort.